She walked into the biggest final of her life, hoping, at best, for a bronze medal. She walked out of it as the first Israeli woman in history to win an Olympic gold medal in any sport, and she did it by beating the two gymnasts who had won every major all-around title in the world since the Rio Olympics 5 years earlier. A run of dominance so complete that most of the sport had already mentally written the gold medal ceremony before a single routine had been performed. Her name is Linoy Ashram, and the two gymnasts she beat that day were Dina Averina and her twin sister Arina, a pair so dominant that, heading into Tokyo, most of the sport considered the individual all-around gold a formality, a medal ceremony that simply hadn't happened yet. Ashram had other plans, and when the scores went final, one of the most decorated gymnasts to ever step onto a rhythmic gymnastics floor did something that told you everything about the moment. She walked across the arena and embraced the woman who had just taken the title away from her. We'll get to exactly what that embrace meant and why it still gets replayed years later. First, you need to know how a hyperactive 7-year-old from a working-class city in Israel, with no infrastructure and no backing, ended up standing across from the two most dominant gymnasts on the planet at all. Linoy Ashram was born on the 13th of May, 1999, in Rishon LeZion, Israel, to parents of Yemeni and Greek Jewish descent, Oren, a standing army soldier in the Israel Defense Forces, and Hedva, a kindergarten teacher's assistant. There was nothing about her background that pointed toward rhythmic gymnastics, a sport historically dominated by athletes from Russia and the former Soviet republics. Built on decades of state-funded infrastructure Israel simply didn't have. With training systems, coaching pipelines, and funding structures Ashram's small local club couldn't come close to matching. "I was a very hyperactive child," Ashram later said. "I couldn't sit still. I had to move and do sports. My mom saw that and decided to send me to an after-school sports club, a little class that taught rhythmic gymnastics. I really loved that type of sport, competing and wearing the outfits." She started training at 7 years old at Hapoel Rishon LeZion, a club without the resources of the Eastern European programs that had produced every major champion in the sport for a generation. "It's true that this sport is dominated by people from Eastern Europe," she said. "The best athletes are from there. When I was small, I never imagined that it would be possible to reach their level because it felt like their sport. But as I went from competition to competition and I got better, I began to realize that it doesn't really matter where you're from or who dominates the sport. I can still win it because of who I am." She trained, in her own words, without infrastructure, without backing just a local club, a coach who believed in her, and a body type that didn't match the mold the sport had built itself around for decades. Her heritage, Yemeni and Greek, rather than the Eastern European lineage that dominated the sport's history, was often mentioned as unusual for someone competing at this level. A detail Ashram herself came to see, not as a disadvantage, but as motivation to prove the sport belonged to anyone willing to put in the work. Ashram's international career began in 2011, and her senior debut season opened properly in 2014, competing at the Miss Valentine Cup in Tartu, Estonia, then in the junior division at the Moscow Grand Prix, where she finished 9th in the all-around a modest result that nonetheless earned Israel a qualification spot at the Youth Olympic Games. She picked up early hardware at World Cup stops that year too: silver in clubs and hoop in Tashkent, silver for the Israeli team in Minsk. It was the beginning of a long climb, not an overnight arrival, the kind of steady, unglamorous accumulation of small results that rarely makes headlines but quietly builds the foundation for everything that comes later. By 2016, the year of the Rio Olympics, the year Dina and Arina Averina began the run of dominance that would define the sport for the next 5 years. Ashram's world ranking stood at 13th. 13th in the world is a real, respectable ranking for a young senior gymnast still building her case, evidence of genuine progress rather than failure. It is not, however, the ranking of someone anyone expected to eventually dethrone the two most dominant gymnasts on the planet. Ashram did not compete individually at the Rio Games. She was, at that point in her career, still years away from being a name casual fans of the sport would recognize, let alone one associated with beating the sport's two biggest stars on the biggest stage that exists. Her world ranking climbed only gradually over the following seasons, 8th in 2017, still outside the very top tier. still a name mentioned in passing rather than one opponent's specifically prepared for. Drop a comment below. Did you know the woman who eventually beat the Averina twins for Olympic gold was ranked outside the world's top 10 during the very Olympic cycle their dominance began? The climb continued steadily through years. When the record book belonged almost entirely to someone else, the Averina name attached to nearly every major all-around title the sport had to offer. By 2018, Ashram's ranking had jumped to first in the World Cup standings and second in the World Cup combined standings. A genuine breakthrough season that put her firmly into the sport's top tier for the first time, no longer a name mentioned in passing, but a legitimate threat on any given day. At the 2019 World Championships, she won bronze in the individual all-around, along with silver medals in hoop, clubs, and ribbon, and a bronze in ball 5 medals at a single World Championships. An enormous haul for a gymnast still chasing the 2 names ahead of her in the standings, proof that the gap was narrowing in every single discipline at once, not just one isolated apparatus. That same year brought a real setback. An injury forced her to miss the European Championships in Baku entirely. A meaningful gap in a season that was otherwise building real momentum toward the Olympic cycle. Everyone in the sport was already looking ahead to. Missing a major championship to injury is the kind of setback that can quietly stall a career at the exact moment it needs to keep climbing. A lost data point in front of judges and rivals alike who were watching every meet closely as the Tokyo cycle approached. Ashram has cited Russian gymnast Margarita Mamun, a 2016 Olympic champion herself, as her personal idol. The athlete whose career shaped her own sense of what was possible in the sport, even while the era she was actually competing in belonged to someone else entirely. 2 sisters who had turned the individual all-around into something that looked, from the outside, almost like a closed competition. In November 2020, at the European Rhythmic Gymnastics Championships in Kyiv, Ashram won the all-around title outright, her first major individual all-around gold at a continental or world level. Arriving in a year when the pandemic had already postponed the Olympics, she'd spent her whole career building toward. It was the clearest signal yet that the gap between Ashram and the sport's Russian-dominated top tier had genuinely closed, not just narrowed. A statement result delivered in the exact year most athletes were struggling just to keep training consistently at all. When the games were postponed a full year, Ashram chose to see it as an opportunity rather than a setback. Another full year to refine everything. Another full year for a gymnast who had spent her entire career closing distance on the leaders in front of her, one that turned out to matter more than almost anyone realized at the time. Dina Averina, the woman who had spent 4 consecutive years as the undisputed best in the world. The reigning multiple-time world champion, who had just watched an Olympic gold medal. She'd been expected to win for half a decade, slip away by the narrowest of margins, walked over to Ashram, and embraced her on the competition floor. In front of a global television audience that had spent years watching the Averina name attached to nearly every major title in the sport. It wasn't a hollow, obligatory gesture. In the days that followed, as controversy and second-guessing swirled around the judging in Russian media, Averina and her sister took the unusual step of publicly asking their own fans to stop directing criticism at Ashram online, refusing to let their own disappointment curdle into something aimed at the woman who had simply outcompeted them that day. A genuinely gracious response to what was, for both of them, the most painful loss of their careers up to that point. Ashram's competitive career didn't stretch much further past that single defining moment. On the 4th of April, 2022, at a press conference in Tel Aviv, 22-year-old Ashram announced her retirement from competition, closing a senior career that had begun in 2015 with a final tally of well over 100 career medals, including 12 at the World Championships and 6 at the Europeans. A resume built almost entirely without the institutional advantages her rivals from Eastern Europe had taken for granted for decades. Today that my business card says Olympic champion, I know it was worth making this journey, she said. An athlete needs to know when to retire. I have fulfilled my dream. I will continue, but on the other side. Israel's culture and sports minister called her a role model in Israeli sports, who has attained unprecedented achievements. Yael Arad, president of the Israel Olympic Committee and herself a former Olympic medalist, called her an incredible athlete, but also an exemplary person. She didn't leave the sport entirely. The Israel Gymnastics Federation immediately offered her a coaching position alongside her longtime mentor, Ayelet Zussman, and Ashram accepted, moving, in her own words, from the other side of the mat. She helped guide Ofer Shaham to a European Championship gold medal in the group all-around in 2022. In late 2024, she was named to help lead an entirely new Israeli junior group, working alongside coach Julieta Cantalupi to develop the next generation of the country's rhythmic gymnasts. Names like Abigail Shved, Taisia Sokolenko, Sofia Prezin, and Karen Sobol, teenagers who were still in primary school when Ashram delivered the routine that changed Israeli gymnastics forever, now training under the direct guidance of the woman whose own upset made all of their careers feel possible in the first place. Off the mat entirely, she became a genuine national celebrity, appearing on Israel's beloved Festival holiday production, competing on The Masked Singer, and taking part in Dancing with the Stars, the kind of crossover fame usually reserved for a country's biggest household names. A level of visibility rhythmic gymnastics in Israel had simply never had access to before her. 15 years of training built toward 26 seconds of floor routine, set to Hava Nagila, against two of the most dominant gymnasts in the history of the sport, on the one afternoon when nobody, including Ashram herself, expected her to win. She now spends her days on the other side of that exact equation, the coach in the corner, watching a new generation of Israeli gymnasts try to build the same kind of career she once built from nothing in a sport with no shortage of dominant dynasties, and one afternoon in Tokyo where the dynasty simply didn't hold. Every young gymnast she coaches now trains inside a program that exists, in large part because one afternoon in Ariake proved a career like theirs was actually possible, a program built on the direct evidence that a gymnast from a club with no infrastructure could still, somehow, beat the two best in the world on the one day it counted most. Does one of Ashram's own junior gymnasts eventually chase down an Olympic medal of her own, coached by the woman who once pulled off the upset of a generation? Drop your prediction in the comments. I read every single one. If this story hit you the way it hit me, hit subscribe, because there's always another underdog story worth telling.